Hi, welcome to Bernard's Essay Talk, and today's question is anarchism an example of individualism or collectivism? In many ways, this is a question about the coherence of anarchism, because to say whether it is one thing or another is to look for a kind of singular understanding or a singular kind of definition. And I'm going to approach this in 4 sections. The first is to look for the common ground shared by anarchists. The second is to identify possible areas of difference. And the third and the fourth will be to outline the ideas and the differences between collective anarchism in the third section and individual anarchism in the fourth one. And in terms of what I'm going to argue, in terms of a thesis statement, I'm going to argue that anarchism by its nature can never be reduced to a singular strand or type. However, it can usefully be grouped into collective and individual camps. And although neither can claim to fully represent the whole of anarchist thinking, I think collective anarchism has the greater weight of history and therefore the greater number of followers. And if the theory of anarchism is varied and multiple, I think its practice has been very much dominated by collective anarchism. So if I'm to plump for one side, I would say that anarchism is more an expression of collectivism. Okay then, so starting with section 1 and looking for the common ground amongst anarchists. And of course, this is found in one place, which is the state. Because if there's one thing that unites anarchists, it's their opposition to the state. And the anarchist argument against the state has 2 parts to it. The first is concerned with its nature, and the second is concerned with who it represents. Now, in terms of its nature, anarchists would both agree and disagree with the great German sociologist Max Weber, who famously defined the state as having a monopoly over legitimate violence. Now, the anarchists would agree with the first part of that, which is to say that they see the state as rooted in force, coercion, and violence. But they would strongly disagree with the second part, arguing that this is not legitimate. And following liberals, they see the state in many ways as the ultimate form of concentrated political power, and they would agree with the great liberal Lord Acton that whereas power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. So the anarchists then see the state as an oppressive form of concentrated abusing power. Now, in terms of who the state represents, the representatives of the state would argue it represents the whole of society. But as you can imagine, the anarchists think, no, this is not true. It really just represents the powerful. And in this way, the anarchists have a kind of similar view of the state as to the Marxists, who would argue that the state is the executive committee to organise the affairs of the bourgeoisie. Though for anarchists, it can be any group that take possession of the state and go on to use its power to pass law backed up by force imposed on all of us. It represents just a section of society, but its law is applied to all. So anarchists present the state as variously artificial, as alien to our interests, as the root of all oppression, and even the most powerful criminal organisation in the history of humanity, engaged in a kind of legalised plunder. And as part of this, anarchists reject the social contract theories of the state, which were developed in the 17th century by philosophers like Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau, explaining how government came into existence. And this kind of argues that before the existence of government, we lived in what they called a state of nature, which in its extreme form, which is the form given by Hobbes, This was a place of existential threat and total fear. And from that place, individuals consented to a contract whereby they would give up their rights to the all-powerful ruler in return for protection and prosperity. Now, for anarchists, this is a theory built on a myth, and they reject the myth, they reject the view of human nature which it's based upon, and they reject the idea that there was ever any kind of consent given in this imaginary history. So they really don't like the state. And I think if there's one quote that sums up the anarchist contempt for the state, it's this amazing quote from Proudhon, which is a bit long, but it just about covers all the bases. So he says, "To be governed is to be watched, inspected, spied upon, directed, law-driven, numbered, regulated, enrolled, indoctrinated, preached at, controlled, checked, estimated, censured, commanded, noted, registered, counted, taxed, stamped, measured, assessed, licensed, authorized, admonished, prevented, forbidden, reformed, corrected, punished, drilled, fleeced, exploited, monopolized, extorted, squeezed, hoaxed, robbed, repressed, fined, vilified, harassed, hunted down, abused, clubbed, disarmed, bound, choked, imprisoned, judged, condemned, shot, deported, sacrificed, sold, betrayed, mocked, ridiculed, derided, outraged, and dishonoured. That is government. That is its justice. That is its morality." So there's Proudhon and giving it to the man. Okay, so they're united in their opposition to the state. Now let's turn to the second area, which is where there is scope for disagreement. And the scope for disagreement within anarchism is enormous. And that's why this is a very important part of an essay which is asking, is it a single thing? Well, it's not a single thing. There's an enormous scope of difference. And that difference comes from at least three different sources. The first is from the difference in place and time where anarchism is developed. The second is in the difference in the temperament between the greatest of its thinkers. And the third, which is an extension of the second, the different interpretations that these thinkers give to almost every idea in anarchism. So taking each of those in turn, probably the differences in place and time is the most important here, because collective anarchism is primarily European, it's generally left-wing, and it was developed over the 19th and 20th centuries. This is often referred to classical anarchism. Whereas individual anarchism is primarily, though not exclusively, American, right-wing, and developed over the 20th and 21st century. In terms of the differences of personality, well, to the annoyance of many anarchists, anarchism is often categorised according to its leading figures. And as a philosophy that questions all forms of authority, it's not surprising that these thinkers go off in different directions. And they all have massively different temperament, thinking, and strategy. I mean, if we just take four thinkers from the classical period, Max Stirner was an unpleasant, extreme individualist whose anarchist vision was a world without rights and morality, whereas Bakunin was a warm, massive character, a bear of a man with an explosive belief in the cleansing power of instinctual and revolutionary violence, whereas Kropotkin and Tolstoy were the rather gentle exponents of morality and love. And in terms of the variations of thought, the quote above from Proudhon was taking apart the government. But a government is different from a state. And some anarchists say the enemy is the state. Others talk of government. Some talk of authority. Some point to the hierarchies of patriarchy or God. And of course, some focus on capitalism. So a big variety there. Some look to spontaneous revolution. Others look to create a new anarchist society in a bottom-up process. Some, like Kropotkin, see the basis of a new society as based on human goodness. Others, like Max Stirner, see it as based on competitive egoism. And all of them have different ideas about human nature, about freedom, and about equality. So the collectivist anarchists see human nature as essentially moral. The individualist anarchists see it as essentially rationalist. And someone like the anti-intellectual Bakunin saw human nature as wholly instinctual. And in terms of freedom, collective anarchists look to positive freedom, while individual anarchists look to negative freedom. And turning to equality, Godwin thought we were equal in our capacity to reason, Tolstoy thought we were equal in the eyes of God, and Rothbard thought we were equal in our right to private property. So in all of this, the ideology of anarchism is itself completely anarchic. Much of it is inspired, but much of it is also unsystematic, contradictory, and very, very varied in its thinking. But to the degree that we can classify and organise this diverse and rebellious philosophy, it is perhaps best done by looking at its collectivist and its individualist camps. So moving on now to section 3, collectivist anarchism. Now, this was very much forged in the events and the revolutionary upheavals of 18th to 20th century Europe, which is to say industrialisation, the development of capitalism, and the massive and inexorable growth of the state, the nation state. And this is the intellectual, the economic, the cultural, and the political context of collective anarchism. And its great inspiration is the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And if Hobbes tells the story of fear, Rousseau tells a story of how humanity was corrupted and enslaved, where the innocent, equal, independent, natural man who was inherently good and inherently social, whose pre-political state of nature, he says, was the golden age of our species, was corrupted by the private property, the inequality, and the vanity of our modern age and our modern state. And of course, Rousseau also inspired Marx as well as the anarchists. And collective anarchism is in many ways an outgrowth of socialism and very much part of the revolutionary story of 19th century Europe and its revolutions. Revolutions that began with the French Revolution in 1789 and a whole string of revolutions right the way through to the Russian Revolution in 1917. And the great and the best known of these 19th century anarchists, the triumvirate of Proudhon, Bakunin and Kropotkin, all shared the socialist view of capitalism as a system of power, oppression and hierarchy, and all held similar conceptions of human nature as sociable, cooperative and altruistic, and all prioritised equality as the foundation for human freedom. And I think what is crucial here is that the collective anarchists conceived of freedom as inextricably linked, woven and expressed through society, rejecting the liberal idea of the autonomous individual for the social individual, shaped by and bound to society. So for Bakunin, the revolutionary idea was liberty through solidarity, where following Kropotkin, humanity is one great family and no member can be injured without it being felt by the wider circle of his fellows and ultimately the whole of society. And this leads collective anarchists to embrace positive freedom, looking to shape our destiny through politics, and a politics that is necessarily moral, related to others and embedded in the community. And probably the anarchist that best exemplifies and embodies this is Kropotkin, a geologist and a scientist whose text, Mutual Aid, took issue with Darwin, arguing on the evidence of nature as well as pre-modern societies that Darwin's emphasis on competition and struggle was exaggerated, and that all beings flourish in cooperation, social solidarity and mutual aid. And all of these are part of nature and come naturally to human beings. Okay, so that's collective anarchism. Now finally, let's turn to individual anarchism. And this begins in the same 19th century European context: industrialisation, capitalism, growth of the state. And it's there from the beginning. It's expressed in the very, very earliest anarchists, the pre-socialist anarchists, people like William Godwin and Max Stirner. It continues, of course, into the 20th century, particularly in America with American anarchism, which, although it has its own tradition of collectivist anarchism, had a very deeply felt wider culture of individualism, very much seen as part of the American character, the rugged individual. And in this switch from Europe to America, eventually we're going to see the move from left-wing and collective anti-capitalist anarchism to a right-wing American anarcho-capitalism. And not surprisingly, this individualist anarchism is even more varied than the collectivist anarchism, including the rationalist individual anarchism of Godwin, the extreme individualism of Stirner, the religious individualism of Tolstoy, and a number of individualist but anti-capitalist anarchists in America. But perhaps it's anarcho-capitalist anarchism which is the most interesting and the most important today. And if collective anarchism was inspired by Rousseau, individual anarcho-capitalism is inspired by John Locke, who, as I argued in an earlier film, was the first great philosopher of capitalism, who initiated the idea of natural rights and who defined these rights as the right to life, liberty and the state, which translates in today's language as life, freedom and private property. And if collective anarchism was an outgrowth of socialism, then anarcho-capitalist anarchism is an outgrowth of liberalism, taking the liberal love of individual liberty and its belief in rights, especially property rights, beyond the liberal idea of the minimum state to fully embrace a society without a state at all. And if Kropotkin is the exemplar of collective anarchism, then Murray Rothbard is the exemplar of the individual anarcho-capitalist anarchism. Taking John Locke's idea that individuals have ownership over their bodies and arguing that if individuals own their bodies, what Rothbard is going to call the self-ownership principle, then no one should coerce them. And it is this right to property, beginning with our body, which underpins every other right and which is the basis of capitalism as the true anarchist foundation for a free society. And in Rothbard's anarcho-capitalist utopia, there is no state, just complete voluntarist individualism, where private individuals and firms control every aspect of life, and where there is one libertarian law prohibiting violence against a person and their property. And this is policed by private defence agencies and presided over by free market judges. Okay, so to conclude, in this picture of collectivist and individualist anarchism, there are obviously two broad persuasions whose influences and positions over human nature and freedom, equality and capitalism could not, as the diagram on the screen suggests, be more stark. With collective anarchism influenced by Rousseau and socialism, looking to human nature as moral, committed to positive freedom, expressed through society and premised on equality, and unremittingly opposed to capitalism as a system of power, oppression and hierarchy. While individual anarchism is mainly influenced by Locke and liberalism, looking to human nature as rational, committed to negative freedom as the protection of the single and autonomous individual, with much of it supportive of capitalism as an alternative anarchist foundation for a free society. But of course, within each of these camps are multiple divisions themselves. On the collectivist side, Proudhon was a mutualist, Bakunin a collectivist, and Kropotkin a communist. Now, these are all very different. We don't have time to go into it here. And on the individual side, as I said before, each thinker carried their own differences of temperament, thinking, and strategy. So when looked at in its totality, neither the collective or the individualist anarchists really represent the whole of anarchist thinking. However, if forced to choose one as the most representative of the anarchist tradition, I would say collective anarchism has the greater weight of history, has the greater number of followers. And if the theory of anarchism is multiple, varied, and anarchic, its practice has indeed been dominated by collectivism.